Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome everyone to the first lecture of third week of the NPTEL course on modernization and creative communication. Today we'll delve into the critiques of modernization. It spans multiple dimensions: economic, cultural, environmental, and political, and highlights alternative frameworks that question the dominance of modernization theory. Let's discuss the foundations of modernization theory. Modernization theory originated as an explanation of societal progression, proposing that all societies evolve from traditional to modern states. This framework gained momentum in the mid 20th century, particularly after World War II, when optimism about economic development was at its peak. Talcott Parsons, a prominent sociologist of the 20th century, played a pivotal role in shaping the discourse on modernization by conceptualizing it as a linear and inevitable process of societal development. Drawing on the theoretical framework of structural functionalism, Parsons introduced the influential concept of evolutionary universals, which describe the essential social structures and processes that facilitate societal progress. According to him, societies evolve in a manner akin to biological organisms, gradually moving toward higher levels of complexity, differentiation, and modernity. Parsons argued that this evolutionary trajectory was characterized by the emergence and refinement of specialized institutions, each fulfilling critical functions necessary for the stability and advancement of society. For instance, economic systems became increasingly complex, facilitating the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. Governments developed more intricate forms of administration and governance to maintain order and address the needs of expanding populations. Similarly, education institutions grew in importance, playing a central role in transmitting knowledge, skills, and cultural values across generations. In Parsons' view, these institutions did not operate in isolation, but were interdependent, working together harmoniously to promote social cohesion and drive societal growth. By emphasizing the interrelation of these systems, Parsons provided a framework for understanding modernization as a holistic and systematic process. His ideas significantly influenced social thought, particularly in the mid 20th century, and became foundational to discussions about development, progress, and the transformation of the traditional societies into the modern ones. Similarly, Rostow's stages of economic growth presented modernization as a sequential process. Rostow proposed 5 stages starting from the traditional society characterized by subsistence agriculture, moving through industrialization and culminating in the age of mass consumption, where consumer goods dominate the economy. His model was particularly appealing to policymakers and development agencies in the global south, as it provided a roadmap for economic development in the global south. However, modernization theory was quickly critiqued for its ethnocentric assumptions and Western bias. By framing Western societies as the pinnacle of progress, it dismissed the diversity of cultural, economic, and social systems in non Western regions. It ignored the historical and structural inequalities created by colonialism, which complicated the path to modernity for many societies. Modernization theory's assumptions also fail to account for the agency of non Western societies. By imposing a universal framework, it neglected the ways in which the societies adapted to and resisted global pressures. For example, traditional agricultural practices in India, which prioritize sustainable resource use, were often dismissed as primitive under modernization frameworks, even though they provided ecological balance and community cohesion. The optimism surrounding modernization theory began to unravel by the mid 20th century. Post World War II development projects, often based on Western models, failed to produce the anticipated outcomes in the global south. Instead of uniform economic growth, these initiatives frequently led to uneven development where wealth concentrated in urban centers while rural areas lagged behind. Persistent poverty amidst affluence highlighted the limitations of modernization theory. For example, in Latin America, industrialization projects in cities like Sao Paulo and Buenos Aires coexisted with extreme poverty in rural areas. These disparities underscored the inability of modernization theory to address structural inequalities rooted in global capitalism and colonial histories. The ecological consequences of modernization has also become evident. Large-scale industrial projects often resulted in environmental degradation, for instance, deforestation in Southeast Asia and the Amazon basin. Spurred by modernization focused on resource extraction, devastated ecosystems, and displaced indigenous communities. These unintended consequences raised questions about the sustainability of modernization as a development model. Furthermore, modernization theory struggled to explain the rise of socio-political unrest in the global south. From peasant uprisings in Southeast Asia to labor strikes in African mining towns, these movements exposed the alienation and exploitation often inherent in modernization projects. Such crises demanded alternative frameworks to better understand and address these complex realities. Another major issue was the neglect of cultural context. In countries like Nigeria, attempts to modernize political and economic institutions led to significant unrest as these reforms clashed with existing social norms and structures. For instance, the imposition of centralized governance system disrupted traditional forms of leadership, resulting in widespread resistance. Dependency theory emerged as a direct critique of modernization theory, emphasizing the historical and structural inequalities that perpetuate underdevelopment in the global south. Rather than viewing underdevelopment as a stage to be overcome, dependency theorists argue that it was a product of the global capitalist system. Andre Gunder Frank coined the term development of the underdevelopment, describing how peripheral economies were systematically exploited to serve the needs of the core industrialized nations. He argued that colonial histories shaped these dependencies, with resources extracted from colonies enriching the core at the expense of the periphery. This exploitation continued post-independence as former colonies remained reliant on exporting raw materials while importing manufactured goods. This trade imbalance perpetuated economic inequalities. Samir Amin elaborated on this critique by introducing the concept of delinking, a radical approach aimed at redefining the relationship between peripheral nations and the global capitalist system. According to Amin, delinking doesn't imply complete isolation from the global economy, but rather a strategic disengagement from the exploitative dynamics imposed by the international capitalist order. He argued that peripheral nations whose marginalized in the global economic hierarchy to shift their focus away from fulfilling the demands of international markets, which often prioritize the interest of core nations and instead pursue a model of autocentric development. Autocentric development emphasizes building an economy that is primarily self-reliant and centered on meeting the unique needs and aspirations of the local population. This approach entails fostering domestic industries, prioritizing local resources, and cultivating social and economic policies that serve the well-being of citizens, rather than subordinating these objectives to the imperatives of the global trade and financial institutions. Amin believed that by reducing dependency on global capitalist structures, peripheral nations could escape the cycle of exploitation and underdevelopment that these systems perpetuate. He saw delinking as both a political and an economic strategy to reclaim sovereignty over national development trajectories, encouraging countries to adopt policies that reflect their cultural, social, and historical context. By doing so, Amin aimed to dismantle the structural inequalities entrenched in the global capitalist system and advocate for a more equitable world order. Examples of this approach can be seen in movements for agrarian reform in countries like Tanzania under Julius Nyerere, who emphasized self-reliance through policies like Ujamaa, African socialism. The experience of Latin American and African economies illustrate these dynamics. In Latin America, commodity-driven economies built around exports like coffee, bananas, and oil remained vulnerable to price fluctuation in global markets. Similarly, African nations continued to rely on mining and agriculture, sectors shaped by colonial demands, to sustain their economies, leaving little room for diversification or domestic industrialization. Dependency theory also highlighted the role of multinational corporations in perpetuating dependency. For instance, the dominance of oil companies in Nigeria's economy not only limited local control over resources but also exacerbated environmental degradation and community displacement in the Niger Delta. Building on dependency theory, world systems theory provides a global framework for understanding economic divisions. It categorizes nations into core, periphery, and semi-periphery, each playing distinct roles in global capitalism system. The core comprises industrialized nations like the United States and Western Europe, which drive innovation and dominate global markets. The periphery, such as Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, primarily supplies raw materials and cheap labor. The semi-periphery includes countries like China and Brazil, which exhibit both core-like industrialization and peripheral dependence on resource extraction. Immanuel Wallerstein, the leading proponent of this theory, argued that the semi-periphery plays a critical role in stabilizing the system by acting as both exploiter and exploited. These nations buffer revolutionary pressures from the periphery. For instance, China's rapid industrialization has elevated it to the semi periphery status, enabling it to exert influence over peripheral nations in Africa while competing with core nations for global dominance. However, this dual role often involves internal contradictions such as environmental degradation and labor exploitation within China itself. World systems theory also emphasizes historical continuity, tracing the roots of the global division of labor back to colonialism. For example, the transatlantic slave trade not only enriched core nations but also established enduring patterns of economic exploitation that persist in modern trade relationships. This historical perspective underscores the systemic nature of global inequalities. Modernization theory's cultural implications have been critiqued for perpetuating cultural imperialism. By promoting values like individualism, consumerism, and secularism, modernization often displaces indigenous traditions and ways of life. Arsis Nandi criticized Western modernity for undermining local knowledge systems and spiritual connections. He argued that modernization imposes a homogenized worldview, eroding cultural diversity. The Chipko movement in India provides a compelling example of resistance rooted in traditional values. This women led initiative opposed deforestation by emphasizing the spiritual and ecological importance of forest. Similarly, in Latin America, liberation theology blended indigenous beliefs with Catholicism to resist capitalist exploitation, showcasing how cultural identities can drive political resistance. Cultural critiques also extend to language and education. The dominance of English in global discourse often marginalizes indigenous languages, which serve as carriers of unique cultural and ecological knowledge. For instance, the loss of native languages in the Americas has paralleled the erosion of traditional ecological practices, demonstrating the interconnectedness of cultural and environmental degradation. Modernization disrupts traditional political systems, creating a political gap where citizens' aspirations outspace institutional capacity. This gap often results in political instability, as seen in newly independent African nations like Nigeria. Despite gaining independence, many African states faced coups and ethnic conflicts due to weak modern institutions incapable of unifying diverse populations. Samuel Huntington argued that political instability arises when social mobilization exceed institutional development. Rapid urbanization and education expansion often lead to increased political awareness without corresponding institutional reforms, exacerbating discontent. The Arab Spring illustrates this dynamic where dissatisfaction with governance in rapidly urbanizing societies sparked widespread protest. These movements underscore the limitations of modernization in addressing the political aspirations of marginalized groups. Political critiques also highlight the erosion of sovereignty in the global south. Dependency theorists argue that international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank often impose structural adjustment programs, which is called SAPs, that prioritize debt repayment over social welfare, further alienating local population. For example, in Zambia, SAP led to the privatization of essential services, deepening economic inequality and political unrest. Modernization has historically emphasized industrial growth, often overlooking the ecological limits and the specific environmental needs of local regions. This approach frequently prioritizes short term economic gains over the long term sustainability of ecosystems. The exploitation of natural resources, a hallmark of modernization, has led to significant disruptions in ecosystems and the displacement of marginalized communities, particularly in the global south. These practices reflect a disregard for the intricate balance of natural systems and the social equity of affected populations. Critics of modernization highlight its unsustainable practices, such as the construction of large scale dams, extensive deforestation, and an ongoing reliance on fossil fuels. These activities not only contribute to environmental degradation but also exacerbate social inequalities, disproportionately impacting vulnerable communities. Such critiques have laid the foundation for calls to rethink development paradigms and prioritize sustainability. Ecologists and environmental activists have been at the forefront of advocating for a shift toward sustainable development and ecological balance. Their work underscores the need to integrate environmental considerations into economic and industrial planning. A seminal contribution to this discourse came from the Club of Rome in 1972 with the influential report Limits to Growth. The report emphasized the environmental consequences of unchecked modernization and underscored the finite nature of Earth's resources. It served as a wake up call, urging policymakers to consider ecological limits and adopt practices that harmonize development with environmental stewardship. Large dams have often been associated with significant environmental and societal consequences. The Three Gorges Dam in China, one of the largest hydroelectric projects in the world, displaced millions and millions of people and altered entire ecosystems. The construction of the dam flooded vast areas, destroying habitats, disrupting wildlife, and affecting the livelihoods of local communities. Similarly, the Narmada Dam in India sparked widespread protest, particularly from those who faced displacement. These protests highlighted the human cost of such mega projects, as marginalized communities were often forced to relocate without adequate compensation or support. Deforestation, particularly in the Amazon rainforest, has been another prominent example of environmental degradation linked to modernization. The Amazon has been increasingly cleared for agricultural expansion, particularly for cattle ranching and soy farming. This destruction not only contributes to habitat loss and species extinction, but also exacerbates climate change by reducing the Earth's capacity to absorb carbon dioxide. The loss of these vital forests significantly impacts global weather patterns and biodiversity. Urbanization, especially in rapid industrializing cities like Delhi and Beijing, has led to several severe environmental challenges. Most cities have faced smog crisis, where the concentration of pollutants in the air reached hazardous levels. The rapid growth of industry and population in the cities has outpaced the development of adequate infrastructure to manage pollution, leading to widespread health problems. These costs of modernization emphasizing the need for sustainable development practices. Social disenfranchisement refers to the disruption of traditional social structures, often caused by external forces such as industrialization, modernization, or colonization. As these forces reshape societies, they often erode long established ways of life, displacing communities and disrupting social cohesion. This disenfranchisement frequently impacts marginalized groups, leading to a loss of cultural identity and social power. The rational peasant theory proposed by James C. Scott suggests that peasants make rational decisions based on economic survival and efficiency. According to this theory, farmers act to maximize their resources and minimize risk, often adopting agricultural practices that align with their immediate survival needs. However, Scott's work contrasts with the idea of cultural uniqueness, as discussed by anthropologists like George E. Marcus and Clifford Geach. They argue that culture plays a significant role in shaping economic decisions, with peasants adhering to traditional practices that hold cultural and social significance rather than merely responding to economic incentives. An example of resistance to agricultural modernization can be seen in Southeast Asia, where local farmers have resisted the adoption of industrial agricultural practices that prioritize monoculture and heavy use of chemicals. These modern methods often clash with traditional farming practices, which are more sustainable and embedded in the cultural fabric of the community. This resistance highlights the tension between economic rationality and preservation of cultural uniqueness. Tariq Banouri critiques modernization for its tendency to prioritize impersonal, bureaucratic relations over personal, communal ties. He argues that as societies modernize, the emphasis on industrial growth and state driven development often undermines the social fabric of communities. In the process, personal relationships that traditionally held communities together are replaced by more abstract, transactional interactions, eroding the sense of belonging and solidarity within society. The shift towards impersonal relations not only affects individual sense of identity but also impacts the overall cohesiveness of communities. The impact of this transition can be seen in the disruption of traditional social behavior and community bonds. As modernization encourages economic growth through market driven practices, the social connections that once defined collective living are diminished. Communities become less reliant on one another and more on state institutions or commercial entities, leading to a breakdown in mutual support systems and collective responsibility. An example of this can be observed in Africa, where state driven development projects often displaced communal land practices. In many African societies, land was traditionally held and managed communally, with strong ties to the land and collective approach to its stewardship. However, modernization and state policies have often replaced these practices with individual land ownership and private property, undermining community cohesion and traditional ways of life. This displacement has contributed to social fragmentation as individuals and communities no longer share the same bonds of responsibility and connection to the land and one another. From a postcolonial perspective, modernization is often seen as a form of neocolonialism that perpetuates dependency and cultural imperialism. While colonialism was formally dismantled, its legacy continues through economic, cultural, and political structures that prioritize Western ideologies and systems. Modernization, in this view, is not merely a neutral or progressive force, but a mechanism that enforces the dominance of Western modes of development over local tradition and practices. Modernization, in this view, is not merely a neutral or progressive force, but a mechanism that enforces the dominance of Western models of development over local traditions and practices. Education systems in many countries of the global south are a prime example of this continued neo-colonial influence. These systems often mirror the frameworks established during colonial rule, focusing on Western knowledge and undermining indigenous ways of knowing. As a result, indigenous histories, languages, and cultural practices are marginalized or erased. Postcolonial theorists like Frantz Fanon and Edward Said argue that this form of intellectual domination contributes to the psychological alienation of colonized peoples whose cultures are devalued in favor of Western ones. Additionally, postcolonial scholars critique the representation of Global South in development discourse, highlighting how the narrative of modernization often frames non-Western societies as backward or underdeveloped. This portrayal serves to justify external interventions which are presented as benevolent efforts to uplift these societies. However, these interventions are frequently aligned with Western interest, perpetuating economic dependency rather than promoting genuine local driven development. For instance, development projects in Africa often frame poverty as a lack of modernity, ignoring the historical context of exploitation, such as colonial extraction of resources, the imposition of arbitrary borders, and the structural inequalities that persist today. Rather than addressing the roots of poverty, modernization efforts tend to reinforce the idea that African societies need to catch up to Western standards of progress, thus reinforcing historical power imbalances and the ongoing cycle of dependency. This critique, found in the works of scholars like Arturo Escobar and Dipesh Chakravarty, underscores the need to reconsider the assumptions underlying modernization and embrace alternative, postcolonial frameworks of development that prioritize local knowledge, autonomy, and cultural diversity. Modernization theory provides valuable insights into societal change, but is fraught with limitations. Its critiques, spanning dependency theory, world systems theory, and cultural perspectives, underscore the need for more nuanced and context sensitive approaches to development. Addressing these critiques requires reimagining development in ways that prioritize equity, sustainability, and cultural diversity. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. In the next lecture, we are going to learn about alter modernisms. Thank you.